Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Professor Barry here. Week one, sociological theories and their applications to Soc 212, race, class, gender, sociology of race, class, gender. This video is probably going to be a little bit longer than most the videos for the weeks because we're trying to provide a theoretical foundation for understanding what sociology is all about, its approach, its application to understanding structured inequity, whether it's privilege and domination or the relationship between the two. So it's going to just take a little bit of work to do that. The readings for this week, the content for this week is going to get you further grounded into it. My goal here is to provide you with a background, some information to help ease you into terminology, theories, ideas, perspectives of sociology. And there's a lot of resources that are out there as well. So feel free to jump around and dive into some other sources. I think it's a really powerful quote from Audre Lorde, philosopher, professor, civil rights activist, gender equality activist. The true focus of revolutionary change is never merely the oppressive situations that we seek to escape. So it's not just the content, the context that we live in, the time period, the place, the social location, but that piece of the oppressor that lies within each of us. And the reason I included that particular quote is start thinking about, yeah, we live in a world that we get socialized into, and we can adopt particular ways of thinking, knowing, and doing that are reflecting very specific interests, class interest, race interest, interest of the dominant group, without even knowing it. And so it's being able to examine not only different groups and different experiences, but examine our own position within the social world. Okay, so go back to like, okay, what is sociology? I mean, sociology, it's got a long history. Some identify Ibn Khaldun and in the 1400s, an Arab philosopher, sociologist, historian, a person who started the practice of demography, studying populations. Some people go back that far. Most introductory sociology classes identify Auguste Comte, the Age of the Enlightenment, 1500s, 1600s is the advancement of sociology, the systematic study of society. Um, Regardless, I think, like Khaldun is saying here, that following customs and traditions just because that's the way they're doing things. It means that we're not active. We need to be more active and be engaged, thinking more critically and thoroughly about what's going on in the world around us versus just reacting to or just carrying forward the past without thinking about more critically about what happened in the past and what do we want to do in terms of modeling for the future. So think about, I don't know, as an example of the unhoused or homelessness. There's a lot of macro level reasons. We may have particular beliefs and convictions. We may have been socialized into thinking certain things about individuals who are unhoused or homeless. But we're trying to develop a more systematic study of social issues and about the population. So there could be a lot of different factors. I've listed here very macro level. There could be, we get into the micro level as well, which is about meanings that individuals have. So individuals who are experiencing being unhoused and homeless, like, okay, what's studies of looking at stigmatization or reactions from the community or their own identity, their own experience. Also, meanings from the dominant group. So, what is it for people of that are housed, people of different economic levels, people of different regions of the country, different social locations? How do they think about people who are unhoused and social policies addressing homelessness? I mean, that's going to be another micro level of meaning. And so we're going to look at that interrelationship between micro, macro, meaning, language, understanding, identity, structure, institution, and the relationship between the two. And we're trying to understand more systematically society. So I don't know, just give you a different example. So if you look at the macro level, political, economic, legal, institutional, cultural, all these different kind of elements, right? So we got the larger economy, legal system, educational system, religion, various institutions. We have our culture, our values. These are all very macro level kind of things. Then we have the micro level about that individual identities, meanings, language, and we see that relationship between the two. I can't actually open up these videos during these video lectures because then YouTube's going to flag it as copyrighted material. But I encourage you to look at it, open up the PowerPoint that I included, and open up this particular short video about civil rights or monuments to the Civil War. And there's an interesting history, the untold story of a place outside of Atlanta, Georgia, called Stone Mountain, that Martin Luther King in his "I Have a Dream" speech referred to, all the way from Stone Mountain, Georgia. This is a place where there's a monument to the Confederacy, and it's interesting to examine and informative and important and valuable to understand what is the history behind the development and construction of these particular monuments. There may be multiple perspectives and different things to consider and think about as far as monument building. There's on the one side of thinking about that these monuments were used as a way to reinforce a particular social order. For some, the pain and suffering for their own family members who were fought in the Civil War, and it's a monument. I mean, it may be a little bit more nuanced. So important to address, I think, both the macro level, like where do these come from, who's funding them, who's supporting them, how are they, the city governments, county governments, state governments, how do they sponsor these particular monument building? How is this a reflection of our cultural values? Different than, for example, in Germany or in other places when there's been atrocities. How do these different nations and countries deal with histories of inequity? And then we get into the micro level. Things mean different things based on one's social position, whether it's race in this case, or if somebody's from a particular region of the country. So it's this relationship between micro and macro. Okay, so sociological imagination. One of the things you're going to read is about sociological imagination. And C. Wright Mills wrote this and published this book in 1959. And the context around this is that in 1959, a time period where growth post World War II, it's an age what many defined as an age of conformity, complacency. Um, the economy was booming, and a lot of people, especially members of the dominant group, were not asking questions about inequality and things that were going on in the world around them. So he wrote this book to encourage more dynamic thinking about the social world. A couple things that he brings out. I think hopefully during when you read the article, you'll discover different things. But one thing will walk across or come across is this idea that our own histories, our own biography, is connected to history. So to understand oneself and one's own journey, one needs to understand the historical time period, the social location. By social location, I mean like the class of the individual, race, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, religious affiliation, understand all that stuff, to understand the context, to understand, one's own biography and understand the biography of others. This goes back to a concept I mentioned or in the overview video about developing empathy. One of my hopes in this class is developing empathy and understanding of other groups and experiences. And then he goes on to separate out private troubles and public issues. So experiencing discrimination through the legal system, let's say, or educational system, it's a private trouble. It's a private individual experience. But it's a larger public issue. It's not just one person experiencing that. It's a larger public issue. So looking at, within law enforcement, as an example, it could be any institution. All institutions have issues of privilege and domination that are operating within them. So this isn't to identify just law enforcement, but with the rise and development of Black Lives Matter and people concerned about law enforcement practices within law enforcement, that it's not just about George Floyd or a particular individual, the private trouble. It's the larger public issue. And Mills is focusing our attention and trying to draw our attention to the larger public issue and to not get distracted by like the individual case, but to think more globally, more macro level. So it moves our attention to the structural conditions and society versus the individual. There's an OPB article I encourage you to open up. It's a short little article about the long history of how and why Oregon is and became white, predominantly white. And that has to do with structure, institution, and history. And it's understanding that history is to understand the present. Okay, so core sociological theories. Three main theories: structural functionalism, we just call it functionalism; conflict theory, we call it Marxism; and then symbolic interactionism. I included a video link to an overview of the three theories. There's a lot of people who do overviews of the three theories. You can take whole classes in these theories, so we're just kind of giving the basic framework of these theories. And the reading that you have for this week provides more information, which is super valuable at getting you grounded in these theories. All right, the first one, structural functionalism. This idea that society is a problem-solving entity. If a problem arises in society, societies are trying to maintain balance and order. If there's a dysfunction in society and the dysfunction gets large enough, there's a sense that society is going to respond to that. It's self-preservation, it's system preservation kind of logic. The idea here is that society is like a biological system. It's adapting to changes in the environment. The speed of change sometimes happens really fast, but this is a condition called anomie when things are changing so fast. It's very disruptive, and societies are trying to keep up with the social change that's going on within society, whether that change is generated by technology, structures, institutions, ways of life. Things happen and change. It's dynamic, and societies are trying to respond to what's going on in the world around them. So if we go back to like law enforcement, post George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, a microscope on law enforcement practices and addressing where can we find reform in terms of hiring, training, and practices within law enforcement to prevent or minimize the likelihood of the abuse of police authority. And this would be a representation of the value consensus, a general agreement among the population that individuals working in law enforcement should be protecting the public from harm, not being instigators of harm. And so this is a representation of our value consensus and working towards making sure that that value is being upheld. There's a view that social dysfunctions happen. No system is perfect. And so it's the idea of reform and to bring social change in a slow, gradual way. That's reforming institutions that might have a problem. So we could apply this to addressing the history of race and racial inequalities by asking questions such as, what are our values? This is our meaning consensus. What's the general agreement about values about diversity in American culture and society? It's important to have a clear set of values because then we have something that we all can go to and say, okay, this is the values that we're representing, that we're trying to achieve, and we're working towards making that happen. If we have a lot of division and separation on what these values are, it's going to be hard to be able to create a balanced social order. So too much division creates too much separation, dysfunction, makes it difficult for doing the work of society. And then we started getting into like socialization. Well, we have to learn these values. So if we have this sort of value of respecting other, an appreciation, a validation of the different experiences of different groups, helping to ensure that people are treated fairly and justly, that they're not being discriminated based on various categories, race, veteran status, gender, sexual orientation, religious affiliation, so that we have these values that they're in institutions and they're there for a reason, right? And we have to be taught and socialized into the importance of these particular values. And there can be dysfunctions, like sometimes it's not working that way. So sometimes we can find incidences where the values are not being upheld, and we're working towards helping to ensure that these values are upheld. Okay, then we move into conflict theory. This is like a Marxist perspective. And Marx is advocating for the examination of the social world to create a more just social world. I think in a core concept for Marx is this idea of materialism, historical materialism. And materialism isn't what we own and what we possess, but it's the material, let's just say the economic world. It's the world of, for example, we live in a world of industrial capitalism, post-industrial capitalism, starting in the 1970s and on. Some people talk about we're in late capitalism today, like a different stage of capitalism. If we go back before capitalism, we have predominantly agrarian societies. We keep on going back to different structures, economic structures, and these are the material structures. And for Marx, it's the material structure that determines the dominant thoughts, ideas, beliefs, practices, and institutions within society itself. So look at the rise and development of a formal educational system. Mandatory schooling in the United States happens in the mid late 1800s. Well, why then? I mean, we got industrial capitalism is moving, and child labor laws are put into place. Kids are no longer working, and it's need to create an obedient workforce. And so having kids have schools or a place for kids to be, since they're not going to be working. They're being socialized into values and ideals. Maybe part of that is being learning a sense of obedience and respect of authority, training them for jobs and occupations in the future. So, I mean, that's just an example of thinking about, for Marx' perspective, that it's the economic structure that's influencing the conditions of society itself. For Marx, you have this sort of idea in a rise and development of capitalist system that you have the bourgeoisie, the owners, and then you have the workers, the proletariat. He identified other classes as well, but these are the two that are most frequently talked about. And his idea was that the ownership class institutions reflect their interest. If you look at college admissions and a recent Supreme Court case that challenged the idea of certain ideas or approaches of addressing diversity, racial diversity among applicants to as being part of the examination process. And it was, Harvard University versus, I can't remember the organization that brought that case forward. And it's interesting that there's this concern about colleges and institutions examining race, providing some allowance for or recognition of past discrimination and its impact on education, schooling, and perhaps an influence on application and admission. That there's a talk about, there's like we need to remove this focus on race and institutions promoting racial diversity. At the same time, a lot of these institutions provide or allow for legacy status. So individuals that have family members that went to that college and university get an advantage when they're applying for these particular institutions. They get a leg up. And that represents ruling class interest. I mean, so it's protecting. So institutions are protecting interest, and this is a theory that we can use to be able to examine the historical conditions and how that happens today. So compared to functionalism, for conflict theory, no longer it's not that we have a value consensus. We're being forced into and coerced. The dominant group or the majority of people, the proletariat, are being forced and coerced into a value system. And that coercion being forced into you happens through control of values and beliefs and ideas in society. That sometimes we develop what's called false consciousness, where people aren't even aware that they're developing ideas that are representing interest of the ruling class, and they're involved in their own coercion, so to speak. And then for Marx, the idea is like to have class consciousness awareness to advocate for social change requires social movement, requires the organization of people to basically generate a social movement to challenge the existing order and structure and promote social change. So this is a model of social justice. Its model of social change, it's radical restructuring of society. It's not reform. Reform isn't go deep enough and far enough. It's about a radical restructure of societies. Things like critical race theory, examining the ways in which um, the legal system policies and practices and rulings came out of a place of inequality and reinforced inequality and helped to justify inequality. That's kind of where critical race theory started in law departments and law school, and trying to encourage the examination of looking at how legal cases came from and out of a culture of inequality and reinforcing inequality as well. Feminist theory, queer theory, theories and perspectives that are challenging the relationship between dominant groups and subordinate groups in society, or those power relations that are going on. So we could apply conflict theory, talk about institutions come out of and reinforce inequality, educational system, whether that's, the funding, the resources, the location of schools, the way that we have schools that are very class segregated, and a lot of stuff we could sort of look at and examine within that. The development of our private educational system, historical exclusion of certain populations from higher education. I mean, there's a lot of stuff to kind of go after their gender in higher education. What content is being covered in a high school and college education? What is not? These are all issues to be discussed. The legal system. I just put it as an example here, a case of Oregon versus Rideout in 1978. That was the first court case where a person was tried and convicted of sexually assaulting their spouse. So before that, so before 78, there was never a conviction of someone sexually assaulting their spouse within a marital relationship. That was viewed as a private matter, not a public matter. So sad, legal systems reinforcing a particular inequality. You could argue or have a perspective that the criminal justice system or any system, healthcare, education, it responds to things versus focusing energy on addressing the root of the problem. Social science data and research for decades upon decades identified, if you look at a kind of a distribution and a pie chart, what's the main contributors to violent crime, and a big chunk of that has to do with economic inequality. And if we don't develop policies and put policies in place that are helping to address economic inequality, um, and its impact, we're not preventing future activity. We're just focused on, responding to. And the question is, well, whose interests are served by not addressing things like economic inequality? And the issue would be it's the ruling class or those with the most resources. So the goal is to examine the manifestation of inequalities to promote greater equity within society. I think a really powerful interview discussion about about the Red Power movement, the American Indian movement in the 1960s, 70s, but fast forward to Standing Rock. It's probably like 8 years ago, maybe not that long. But addressing mobilization of people. And I encourage you to watch that as well. And then finally, symbolic interactionism. So here we're looking at language, symbols, perceptions, and their meaning. The Thomas theorem is if you define it as real, it's real in its consequences. So we'll talk about in this class in a couple of weeks about race is a social construct. It's not biological. Historically, there was this idea of biological races. And we talked about the social construction of reality, that reality is being constructed by scientists who are promoting this idea of biological race. If we go back to this idea of the Thomas theorem, if you define it as real, it's real in its consequences. So it doesn't matter whether or not the idea of race being whether it doesn't matter that races were not biological, it's that it was defined that way, and then we respond to the world based on our definitions. So we need to be aware of how we define concepts and ideas, how we're defining reality, because we respond to the world individually and collectively based on our definitions. A key idea of symbolic interactionism is that our behavior responses are based on our interpretation. So it's not about the stimulus, the object, it's about the interpretation. And so that becomes an important part. How we see gender identity and sexual orientation today, the stimulus, the object, the behavior of individuals may not have changed, but what's going on is that there's a change in perception that influences a change in response. So we're paying attention to meanings and how meanings are facilitated by social interactions and how meanings take place within a context. Individuals' membership into particular social groups, thinking about like white nationalism, white supremacy, that development and identity in these particular areas, meanings are arising out of social locations, individuals that are part of either progressive or conservative political perspectives, let's say just real alt-right or real strong left. that, that people's development and meaning are coming out of their own interactions within the social world. So we're just going to address self-concept and identity. Short little video about Native Americans being identified as sports mascots. And from a Native perspective, a Native voice, talking about some of the issues, the stereotyping and issues of sport mascots, of Native Americans as sports mascots. So it's a symbol, it's a meaning, and the question of like, well, different groups are going to have different meanings about sports mascots. And what this video is trying to get out of those who are put together this video is trying to encourage a different way of thinking about mascots, the interpretation to encourage a different response among the public. So we're looking at language is powerful, right? So the stimulus, the person, let's say in this case, may not, doesn't, let's just hold that constant, but a different interpretation, a different language assigned to that particular stimulus: immigrant, alien, illegal, undocumented, unauthorized. Each of those has different values and ideas responding to that or behind that. And that facilitates a different level of response. And then finally, this idea of intersectionality, and we'll talk about it more next week as well. That intersectionality, meaning that race, class, gender, gender identity, sexual identity, they are all intersectional. So when we talk about, let's say, white privilege, to recognize that not all whites have the same privilege, that it's intersectional, depends on gender, depends on class. This came out of like, the second wave feminist movement in the 1950s, 1960s. There was exclusion of women of color, women of lesbians, of women of non-normative sexual identity within that particular second wave feminist movement. And a response and a critique of that, so the second wave feminist movement was predominantly concerns of the white middle class America. And there was a critique that this was a very exclusionary movement. It had some powerful impacts and effects, but it was also exclusionary. And a recognition to address the intersectional nature of gender to identify that race also is important to recognize, and also sexual orientation and other dimensions of our identities. And then finally, like equality. Inequality is unequal access to opportunities. Equality is when things are evenly distributed. And sometimes equality is actually unjust because everybody getting the same doesn't address the fact that we are all have different starting points. So if we had distribution of dollars per student to a high school, so if every school got the same dollar amount from the state for a student attending that school, that could reinforce inequality because within a real wealthy district versus a real impoverished district, there's different needs of those within those communities, the students and those institutions, those educational institutions. So a higher level of funding is going to be needed in the lower socioeconomic neighborhood and community to address the unique needs of that particular community and that particular school. So equality sometimes can reinforce inequality. But it can be very tantalizing because it's sort of idea that everybody should be treated the same. But there's an issue I think we address equity is more appropriate oftentimes where it's looking at the needs and just the distribution of opportunities and resources that are available for different groups and adjusting the attention, the resources that are based on need. So things can provide a sense of equity. And there's been more discussions about that in recent years of moving away from just a strict definition of equality to let's focus on equity. What resources do different groups need in order to be participating more equitably or more equally within society itself? And then there's justice to help ensure that everybody has equal access and treatment. There's been a conversation starting more and more starting, I don't know, 5, 10 years ago about universal design in college courses. So to make things visually accessible, reader accessible for students who have learning disabilities, students who have visual impairment, audio impairment, to make it, and that universal design, everybody benefits by that. So that even students who don't have a documented disability or who do not have problems with auditory learning, that they also benefit from having these resources. So things can that a model of justice can serve actually everyone well. So to review for the weekly requirements this week, two different things, three sociological perspectives, C. Wright Mills, sociological imagination. I put another link here, Simon Tam, How to Talk to a White Supremacist, a TED Talk that was really interesting, about the importance of empathy and understanding, engaging in discussions with people who have different perspectives than our own to encourage exploration versus devaluing, holding on to our own values and beliefs, but how to engage in a conversation so we can understand doesn't mean I change my opinion and idea. It's I'm trying to understand. Um, so be thorough, be detailed, 750 to 1,000 words for your summary. Provide content. If there's multiple articles for the week, address content from both or from all things within there. I got nothing specific that you have to address, but you need to hit upon the highlights, main ideas, what you see as the main ideas from the content. If you have questions about that, let me know. Sometimes it takes a week or two to kind of get like really grounded in it and you feel comfortable with the approach for the assignment. So, I mean, I'll provide you feedback for sure just to help facilitate your own learning and help just provide some feedback to help guide you in the class. All right, have a great day. Have a great week.